Riley Carter sat at the worn oak table in his small ranch house, a cup of lukewarm coffee cradled in his hands. Outside, the wind whistled over the dry pasture, carrying with it the faint creak of a sagging barn door. His cattle herd was thin, his savings thinner. The last drought had burned through most of what he had, and the bank wasn't far from taking what was left. He wasn't reading the classifieds to buy anything, just to kill time between chores, when the ad caught his eye. Abandoned mining town for sale, $100 as is. He blinked, certain he'd misread it. A whole town? For the price of a couple bags of feed? He read it again. The description was barely a paragraph long. No photos, no map coordinates, just a brief note. 15 buildings, former gold mining site, sold in current condition. No utilities. Buyer assumes all risk. Riley let out a low chuckle. What kind of fool sells a town for $100? Then again, what kind of fool buys one? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. His ranch was dying slow, and he'd been thinking for months about ways to diversify. Folks paid good money for Western-themed getaways, ghost town tours, photo ops, and old saloons. Maybe this could be something like that, if nothing else. He'd own a strange little piece of history. 2 days later, the deed was his. No bidding wars, no questions from the seller beyond "You sure?" His friends at the feed store laughed until their eyes watered when he told them, "Riley, you've gone and bought yourself a pile of dust and tumbleweeds," said Hank Miller, shaking his head. "Maybe," Riley replied, sliding his hat on. "Or maybe I bought a fresh start." He packed his old Ford with a cooler of food, a couple gallons of water, and his bedroll. The directions from the seller were simple but vague. Follow Highway 63 past Dry Mesa, then take the unmarked dirt road north. 20 miles in, you'll see the first building. By mid-afternoon, he was rolling through miles of desert, the horizon rippling in the heat. The sky stretched wide and empty, the kind of blue you only saw this far from town. A rusted road sign leaned at a dangerous angle. Bullet holes punched through the metal. He passed no other cars, no sign of life except the occasional buzzard circling overhead. The dirt road appeared without warning, nothing more than a scar cutting through pale sand and scrub. Rush. Riley slowed, the truck rattling over ruts and rocks. Dust plumed behind him, and with each mile, the world felt quieter. It was late afternoon when the first building came into view, a leaning shack with a collapsed roof, its door hanging by a single hinge. Beyond it, the town revealed itself in fragments: a weathered church steeple, a line of storefronts with faded paint, an old saloon with swinging doors barely clinging to the frame. Riley parked in the middle of what must have been the main street. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of his truck's engine cooling. He stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. The air was dry as bone, carrying the faint smell of dust and sun-baked wood. "This is it," he murmured, scanning the place. His town. Some of the buildings stood surprisingly solid. Others were nothing more than skeletons of wood and rusted nails. A tumbleweed rolled lazily past, bouncing against the side of an old mercantile. He walked toward the saloon, pushing the creaking doors open. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight. A long warped bar stretched across the room, still, lined with empty bottles. A staircase in the corner led to the second floor, the railing splintered but intact. That's when Riley froze. Upstairs, in the far corner window, a warm glow flickered, faint but unmistakable. Like candlelight, he blinked, rubbing his eyes. The window was empty now, just dusty glass reflecting the street. Probably a trick of the sun, he told himself. Still, a chill slid down his spine. Shaking it off, Riley set his bedroll on the bar and opened his cooler. He'd spend the night here, get a better look around in the morning. As dusk settled, the town seemed to sink deeper into stillness, the shadows stretching long. Somewhere outside, faint and distant, came the sound of laughter. Riley woke just after sunset, the kind of abrupt awakening that came from sleeping. In an unfamiliar place. The saloon was dark now, except for the faint silver light streaming through a crack in the warped doors. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the smell of dry wood and the distant creak of the building brought it all back. The $100 town. The truck parked outside, the flicker of candlelight he thought he saw upstairs. He sat up, listening. Silence. Then, just as he was reaching for his canteen, the silence broke. Somewhere beyond the saloon walls, a board groaned under the weight of a step. Another followed, slow and deliberate. Riley froze, hand hovering over the small revolver he kept in his duffel. The step stopped. He told himself it was probably an animal, a stray dog, maybe a coyote bold enough to nose around. Still, his fingers closed around the gun's handle. When dawn came, Riley felt almost foolish for his nerves. Sunlight spilled down the dusty main street, warming the faded storefronts. The town looked less threatening in the daylight, almost inviting. He decided to make a quick walk through before heading deeper into the surrounding hills. The general store was first. Its shelves still held a few rusted cans, their labels faded to nothing. Behind the counter lay a cracked ledger, the last entry, dated over 2 decades ago. Outside, the air carried a strange stillness. No wind, no insects buzzing, just a low, steady quiet. Riley was passing what looked like an old boarding house when movement caught his eye. A figure stood on the boardwalk about 30 feet ahead. Small. Still. It was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. She wore a faded calico dress and stood barefoot, her hair a wild tangle. Her dark eyes were fixed on him. Riley stopped in his tracks. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice gentle. She didn't answer. "Did you get lost out here?" Still nothing. Before he could take a step closer, the sound of a door slamming cut through the air. A woman emerged from one of the buildings, tall, thin, her face half hidden beneath a sun-faded bonnet. She moved quickly, scooping the girl into her arms. The woman's eyes met his for only a moment. Sharp, wary eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly. Riley blinked. "I own the place. Bought it 2 days ago. The ad said it was abandoned." Her grip on the girl tightened. "It's not." She turned as if to walk away, but Riley stepped forward. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. Just wanted to see what I bought." A new voice cut in from behind him. "You didn't buy our home." Riley turned to see a boy, maybe 16, standing in the shade of the building. His shoulders were lean but squared, his eyes guarded. He held an old single-shot rifle, the barrel pointed toward the ground but not forgotten. "Easy there," Riley said, holding up his hands. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on here." The woman didn't answer. Instead, she gestured for the boy to join her. Together, they started toward a building farther down the street, the girl still clinging to her. "You should leave before dark," the woman said without turning around. "This isn't a place for strangers." Riley stood there long after they'd gone inside. The air felt heavier now, the bright morning sun doing nothing to shake the chill working its way up his spine. He'd come expecting silence, dust, maybe some creaking wood. But people? A whole family living here, off the map. He took a step toward the building they'd entered, but stopped when the boy appeared at the window. The rifle now resting against his shoulder. It wasn't an outright threat. But the message was clear enough. Riley turned back toward the saloon, his boots crunching on gravel. As he reached the doors, he glanced once more over his shoulder. The little girl was at the window now, peering out from behind the woman's skirt. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't afraid either. She just watched him. Rayleigh didn't sleep well that night. The floorboards above him groaned once or twice, though he knew no one lived in the saloon. Twice he thought he heard the faintest scrape of movement outside, like something or someone circling the building. When the first streaks of light touched the street, he decided to break the uneasy standoff from the day before. He grabbed his cooler, slung it under his arm, and walked toward the building where the woman and her children had vanished. The door was locked. He knocked. For a moment, nothing. Then the door cracked open a few inches, and the woman's wary eyes appeared. "I brought breakfast," Riley said, holding up the cooler. "Fresh bread, eggs, jerky. Figure it might be better than whatever you've been getting out here." There was a pause, then the door opened a little wider. The boy with the rifle stood in the corner of the room, watching every move Riley made. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes darting between the strangers. The woman nodded once toward the table. "Set it down." Riley unpacked the food. "Name's Riley Carter. I run a ranch a few counties over. Well, used to run it before it started running me into the ground." The woman didn't smile. "Sarah." She gestured toward the children, Maggie and Will. Riley offered a hand across the table, but Sarah didn't take it. "So you live here?" Her gaze hardened. "We survive here. There's a difference." He glanced around the room. The place was simple but surprisingly tidy. A wood stove in the corner, a table worn smooth from years of use, a line of mason jars filled with what looked like dried beans and herbs. "Forgive me for asking," Riley said carefully, "but why here?" "The papers say this place was abandoned 15 years ago." Sarah's jaw tightened. "The papers are wrong." She finally sat across from him, folding her hands. "When the mining company pulled out, they took everything, equipment, pay, promises. Most folks left. My husband didn't. He'd found something in the hills a few months before. Something worth protecting. We thought if we stayed quiet, no one would come looking. But people always come looking."
Riley leaned forward. What exactly did he find?
Her eyes flicked toward the boy, then back to Riley. "That's not for you to know. Not yet." The words were careful, like she was weighing every syllable. Riley decided not to press, at least not immediately. "You've been here all this time? No store runs? No, anything?" Sarah shook her head. "We grow what we can. Hunt. Trade with a couple folks who don't ask questions." "That's a hard way to live," Riley said. Her gaze was steady. "Harder than losing what's ours." Maggie, the little girl, finally spoke. "Mama says the town's like a sleeping animal. If you poke it too hard, it wakes up angry." Sarah gave her a quick look, but the girl just swung her bare feet under the chair. Riley thought about the flicker of candlelight he'd seen his first night. "I don't mean to cause trouble," he said, "but I did buy this place, legally." Sarah's voice went cold. "A piece of paper from a courthouse in another county doesn't mean anything out here. We've bled for this place. You haven't." The tension hung between them for a long moment. Finally, Sarah stood and began packing away. "The uneaten food, you should go before nightfall." Riley left, but his boots felt heavier with every step. The morning sun was bright, but the town seemed different now, less like a relic, more like something alive, hiding its own pulse. Back at the saloon, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the bar, staring at the dust motes swirling. In the light, something was off. Sarah's story had gaps, and that rifle in the boy's hands didn't look like it was for coyotes. She hadn't lied exactly, but she told him just enough to keep him from asking the wrong questions. And yet, Riley couldn't shake the sense that whatever was keeping them, here was also what might make this place worth saving. He'd come here for $100 gamble. Now it felt like he'd stepped into someone else's fight, out in the street. He thought he saw a shadow move between buildings, quick, purposeful. He wasn't sure if it was Sarah's boy or someone else entirely. Asterisk, the shadow Riley spotted that morning wasn't in his imagination. By the time he stepped outside to get a better look, whoever or whatever it was had disappeared into the alley between two crumbling storefronts. He followed, boots crunching on grit, but the narrow passage was empty. Just heat shimmering in the air and the smell of old wood baking in the sun. He told himself it could have been the boy, Will, keeping tabs on him. But something about the movement had been different, quicker, heavier. By mid-afternoon, Riley decided it was time to try again with Sarah. He carried a small sack of sugar and a bag of flour from his truck, supplies she might appreciate, and knocked on her door. This time, she opened it without hesitation, though her guarded expression hadn't softened. "I came to apologize," Riley said. "I didn't mean to come barging into your life yesterday. I just didn't expect anyone to be here." Sarah stepped aside, and he entered. Will sat near the window, rifle across his lap, while Maggie sorted a pile of pecans on the table. "You're not the first to stumble in," Sarah said, taking the sack from him. "Most don't last the night, but you're still here. I'm starting to think maybe there's more here than the ad let on." Sarah gave a short laugh without humor. "More and less. Depends on how you look at it." They sat down at the table, and for the first time, Sarah began to open up. She told him about the years after the mining company left, how her husband, Daniel, had refused to abandon the place. He believed the land still had something worth fighting for, she said, her voice distant. And he found it, a seam of gold in the hills north of town. Not much by modern standards, but enough for a man who knew how to work it. Riley raised his eyebrows. "Gold? That's what kept you here?" Sarah nodded. "Daniel wanted to file a claim, but he didn't trust outsiders. He said if the wrong people found out, they'd take it. He was right." One of the miners overheard him talking, and soon enough, men started showing up, rough men, armed and desperate. Daniel kept the mine's location a secret, but they killed him trying to get it. Her voice caught on the last words. Maggie stopped sorting pecans and leaned against her mother's arm. Riley felt a hard knot in his stomach. "And you've been here since? Alone?" "Not alone," Sarah said, glancing at Will. "The land's all we have left. I promised Daniel I'd keep it safe for the children." Riley understood the stubbornness. He'd poured years into his own ranch for the same reason, not because it was easy, but because it was his. Still, the idea of raising kids in an abandoned town in the middle of the desert, it was a hard life, and it had danger written all over it. "What about those men?" Riley asked. "Still around?" Sarah's eyes darkened. "Some moved on, but there are a few who never stopped looking. Every so often, they come sniffing around. We hear them before we see them. And when they do, we stay quiet, keep the lights out." Riley thought about the shadow that morning, the movement in the alley. "I think they might be back," he said quietly. Sarah's head snapped toward him. "Why?" He told her what he'd seen. Will's grip on his rifle tightened out. By evening, Riley walked back to the saloon, his mind turning over the pieces of the story. If men were out here hunting for gold, then Sarah and her kids were living under constant threat. And now, with him in the picture, those men might think he was part of it. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in copper and rose. Riley leaned against the saloon's doorframe, scanning the edges of town. That's when he spotted it, a glint of metal far up on a ridge, catching the last light. Binoculars? A rifle scope? It was gone in an instant, but his gut told him the truth. Someone was watching, and not from inside the town. Riley didn't mention the glint of metal to Sarah that night. There was no need. Her family lived like people who already knew they were being watched. Lights out after dusk, movements kept close to the buildings, windows covered from the inside. Still, it gnawed at him. He'd bought this place for $100 thinking it was a strange gamble, maybe a curiosity to fix up. Now it felt more like he'd stepped into someone else's war. The next morning, he saddled up early and headed toward the hills. If someone was up there with binoculars or a rifle, he wanted to know. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by jagged ridges and pockets of scrub brush. He climbed higher, the rocks crunching under his boots. Scanning for footprints near the crest, he found them. Not one set, but 3. Heavy, boot-shaped, recent. They led along the ridgeline, then veered away from town toward a narrow ravine. Really. Crouched, touching the prints. The weight in the stride told him enough. These weren't casual hikers. Whoever they were armed and moving with purpose. Back in town. He stopped at Sarah's. Will answered the door, rifle in hand, as always. I found tracks, Riley said without preamble. 3 men up on the ridge. They've been watching. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. They'll be back, she said. They always come back. Why not leave? Riley asked. You could pack up and disappear before they even knew you were gone. This is our home, Sarah said simply. My husband died for it. I won't run. Riley knew that tone. He'd used it himself when people told him to sell his failing ranch. Pride, stubbornness, a refusal to let go. That evening, the sound came before the sight, a low, growing hum of an engine on the wind. Riley stepped out onto the street just as a battered pickup crested the rise and rolled slowly into town. The truck stopped in the middle of the street. 3 men climbed out. They weren't dressed like drifters, more like hired muscle. Dusty jeans, worn boots, sunburnt faces. 2 carried rifles slung across their backs. The third, a heavy-set man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, kept his hands free but his eyes sharp. Scarface looked Riley up and down. You the new guy? Riley didn't answer right away. Depends who's asking. The man smiled without warmth. We've been looking for a woman and her kids. They'd be about yay high. He gestured. You seen anyone? Riley kept his face neutral. Place looked empty when I got here. One of the riflemen snorted. Funny, because we saw smoke from a chimney yesterday. Old buildings do strange things in the wind, Riley said. Scarface stepped closer, boots grinding in the dirt. Here's how it's gonna go, cowboy. We're gonna take a walk around. If we find what we're looking for, you can leave. If we don't, you're gonna tell us where they went. Riley's voice stayed calm, but his heartbeat kicked up. This is my property now. You're trespassing. The man's grin widened. Then maybe you should sell. From the corner of his eye, Riley caught movement. Will, crouched in the shadows between buildings, rifle aimed low. The boy's hands were steady, his eyes locked on the stranger's. Go back to your truck, Riley said evenly. This isn't your town. Scarface studied him for a moment, then tilted his head toward his men. Let's go. We'll be back. They piled into the pickup, the engine roaring to life. The truck rolled out the way it came, gust rising behind it like smoke. Sarah appeared from the boarding house once they were gone. Her face was pale, lips pressed thin. They know we're here now. Riley nodded. Yeah, and they're coming. Back with a plan. Then we make one of our own, she said. Riley thought about his failing ranch, the empty quiet that waited for him back home. He could leave now, before things turned bad, but something in Sarah's voice and in the sight of Will, already checking his rifle, told him he wouldn't. Not now. Asterisk, they didn't wait until the next day. By mid-morning, while the sun was still climbing and the shadows still clung to the edges of the buildings, Riley heard it, the low growl of that same battered pickup rumbling back into town. Sarah was outside hanging a sheet to dry when the sound reached her. She froze mid-clip, eyes flicking toward the road. Will emerged from the doorway behind her, rifle in hand. "They're early," Riley said from the saloon steps, "or they never left." Sarah replied. The truck rolled in slower this time, like a predator testing the air. Scarface sat in the passenger seat, one elbow hanging out the window. He wasn't smiling now. The vehicle stopped dead center in the street, engine idling. All three men climbed out, rifles visible. The driver, tall and wiry, adjusted the strap on his gun. The third man, younger, with restless eyes, scanned the windows like he expected someone to be watching. Scarface stepped forward. "We're done talking, cowboy." Riley stayed where he was, arms loose at his sides. "You're trespassing." Scarface's mouth twisted. "You keep using that word like it means something. Out here, the only law is who's willing to shoot first." From the corner of his vision, Riley saw Sarah and the kids slip behind the boarding house, heading for cover. "You're looking for something that doesn't belong to you," Riley said. "I told you yesterday, there's nothing here for you." The tall rifleman snorted. "We think otherwise." The younger man started toward the nearest building, peering through a dusty window. Riley's gut tightened. If they found any sign of Sarah's family, it would be over. "You take one more step," Riley said sharply, "and you'll regret it." The young man froze, eyes narrowing. "You threatening me?" "Promising," Riley said. Scarface laughed, short, cold. "You got a gun, cowboy?" Riley didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, his weight on the balls of his feet. It was enough. Scarface's grin faded. That's when the crack of a rifle split the air. Plume of dust exploded a foot from the tall rifleman's boots. He jumped. "Back, cursing." Will's voice carried from somewhere high. The boy had taken position on the boarding house roof. Scarface's head snapped up, scanning the roofline. "You got help?" he said, voice low and dangerous. Riley shrugged. "Told you this wasn't your town." The younger man raised his rifle, but before he could sight in, another shot rang out. This one from behind. Sarah, crouched at the far end of the street, her rifle trained steady. The message was clear. Leave now. For a tense 5 seconds, no one moved. The heat shimmered between them, the whole town holding its breath. Finally, Scarface signaled his men to lower their guns. "Fine, we'll go, but next time we won't just be 3. They backed toward the truck, eyes never leaving Riley. The engine roared as they turned and headed for the ridge, their dust cloud trailing long after the sound faded. Riley let out the breath he'd been holding. Will clambered down from the roof, his young face set hard, but his hands shaking slightly as he reloaded. "You did good," Riley said quietly. Sarah approached, her gaze still on the road. "That was a warning run. They'll be back with more men, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow." "Then we get ready," Riley said. They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the town's natural defenses. Riley showed Will how to set tripwires along the alleys, strings tied to tin cans filled with rocks to rattle if someone passed. Sarah set up firing positions in the windows of the saloon and the boarding house. Maggie, too small to fight, gathered food, water, and blankets in case they had to hole up for a long night. As the sun dipped low, painting the desert blood red, Riley stood in the street and studied the horizon. The wind carried no sound, but his gut told him the fight was far from over. He'd bought this town for $100. Now it was worth something else entirely, the lives of the people who refused to leave it, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The next morning, Riley woke to the sound of voices drifting through the thin walls of his cabin. It wasn't the gentle murmur of the desert wind, it was conversation, low but hurried. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, following the sound toward the old schoolhouse at the far end of Main Street. The building was weathered and leaning slightly to one side, the paint long stripped by the sun. He pushed the door open slowly, its hinges letting out a long groan. Inside, the light filtered through broken shutters, casting striped shadows over the room. At the front, where a blackboard still clung to the wall, sat Samuel, Emma, and the children huddled close, whispering. They froze when they saw him. "What's going on?" Riley asked, his voice even. Samuel's jaw worked before he answered. "We were just talking about what happens next." Emma looked away, but the eldest child, a boy named Caleb, blurted out, "We didn't tell you everything." Riley stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. "Then maybe it's time you did." Samuel sighed and motioned for him to sit. "You think we've been here a year? Try 15. That caught Riley off guard. 15 years? How? Because we're not supposed to be here, Samuel said. Not in the way you think. Emma reached into a canvas bag at her feet and pulled out a bundle of yellowed papers tied with twine. She slid them toward Riley. The first was a deed dated 1904 bearing the name Samuel Whitaker. The handwriting was neat, formal, but what stopped Riley cold was that the ink had not faded as much as it should have. Beneath it were letters, dozens of them addressed to a woman named Emma Whitaker, written in the same hand. "These belong to my grandfather," Samuel said. "He built a home here when the mine was still running. But after the collapse in '08, people fled. My family didn't." Riley flipped through the letters, reading fragments about shortages, sickness, and nights filled with gunshots from claim jumpers. "We've been hiding," Emma said softly. "Generations of us. The outside world never mattered much. This was home, and we stayed. But the land was sold and sold again over the years until it was yours." It was a strange, heavy truth to swallow. Riley's rancher's mind, used to tangible problems like drought and feed costs, struggled to place it. But why stay hidden? He asked. Samuel looked toward the window, his expression hardening. "Because the land here is worth more than people think. There's something under it, something people would kill to own. My grandfather called it the second vein. He never told anyone outside the family." Riley remembered the way some of the mine's boards still bore fresh nails, the way Samuel had steered him away from certain shafts. "You mean there's still gold here?" Samuel didn't answer directly. "I mean, there's something here people would never let us keep." The weight of it hung in the dusty air. Riley understood now why they had avoided him at first. Why? The sheriff's earlier warning had carried a strange edge. "What do you want me to do with this?" Riley asked quietly. Emma's eyes met his, steady but pleading. "You bought the town, but this has been our life. We can't leave. Not without losing everything. We're asking you to let us stay and keep this secret." Riley leaned back in the creaky chair, feeling the enormity of what they were asking settle on his shoulders. His cattle business was failing, his finances thin. But here was a potential fortune sitting beneath his boots. Yet looking at the children, at Caleb trying to act braver than he felt, at little Mary clutching her mother's skirt, Riley felt the pull of something deeper than gold. "I'll need time to think," he said, rising as he stepped outside. The desert sun was blinding. He stood on the porch, breathing in the dry air, but the uneasy feeling in his chest only grew. Somewhere out there, someone else might already know what Samuel had just told him. And if they did, they'd be coming far in the distance, on the shimmering horizon. Riley thought he saw the faint glint of metal a truck's windshield catching the sun. It disappeared a moment later, but the feeling of being watched did not. The ghost town wasn't just his anymore. It was a secret worth killing for. By early spring, Rayleigh's once empty streets had color again. The old general store's windows gleamed under fresh glass panes. The saloon's swinging doors creaked like they had 100 years ago, and the chapel's bell, silent for decades, rang out every Sunday morning, its tone carrying far into the desert. But most importantly, there was laughter now. Not the faint, eerie echoes Riley had first heard when he arrived, but real laughter, children running across dusty streets, people greeting one another, and life spilling into every corner of the ghost town, the family that had been hiding here. So long Grace, her brother Daniel, and little Sophie had begun to shed their fear. Rayleigh had helped them acquire proper identification, connected them with lawyers, and most of all, given them a safe home. For the first time in years, they weren't glancing over their shoulders. Still, the desert had its way of keeping secrets. And one evening, Riley found Grace staring at the horizon from the porch of the old boarding house. "You think they'll ever come looking for us again?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," Riley admitted, leaning on the railing beside her. "But if they do, they won't find you the same way they left you. You've got people now. You've got a whole town watching your back." Grace smiled faintly, but the sadness in her eyes hadn't completely gone. Healing, Riley knew, took longer than fixing a building. That night, the sky burned with streaks of orange and purple. The air was cool and the hum of crickets filled the streets. A caravan of 2 trucks rumbled in from the highway folks from the nearest town, bringing supplies, tools, and the promise to help keep this place alive. It struck Riley then he hadn't just bought an abandoned town for $100. He'd bought a second chance, for himself and for others who had nowhere else to go. The last building to be restored was the old schoolhouse. On its opening day, Sophie stood in front of the chalkboard in a new dress, reading aloud to a handful of other children whose families had also drifted in over the past months. The sound of her voice carried through the open windows, warm and clear. Riley stood in the doorway, arms crossed, heart full. He remembered what the place had been when he first saw it, silent, empty, fading into dust. And now the desert wind carried the smell of bread baking, the ring of hammers, the rhythm of footsteps. As evening fell, the lanterns lit up along the street, one by one, casting golden halos against the wooden buildings. Daniel came up beside Riley and clapped him on the shoulder. "You saved this place," Daniel said. Riley shook his head. "No, we saved each other." And as the night deepened, Riley knew the ghost town wasn't a ghost anymore. It was home.